This is a dark and terrible era where you will find little comfort or hope. Forget the power of technology and science. Forget the promise of progress and advancement. Forget any notion of common humanity or compassion. There is no peace amongst the stars, for in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only crap pipes.
Hello, I'm Luke the Crazy Maker Nerd and welcome to another video. I started with a 12-inch MDF base and a large number of toilet rolls. So I just decided I had a lot of these at the time, so I thought I'd use them all up. I started by cutting them at certain angles and gluing them together with super glue. Then threw on a bit of activator to make sure that they dry quickly so I don't have to hold them for a long time. I did this until I was happy with the arrangement of the pipes. I also cut a number of pipes at different angles and roughened the edges. This was to make them look like they'd been exploded from some kind of torn away war. Next I began looking at different parts. I started by adding a lid to an old shaker. This could work as a vent, and some old Space Marine parts. I then moved on to some wooden dowels. These look a bit like bobbins, so later on I decided to add a bit more to them. I then added a small piece of Lego for good measure, and moved on to some, well, do you remember those COVID tests? Well, I kept all the sticks. I then used my own mixture of mud, which you can watch in the other video. Kept messing up with some Mod Podge until I hit the right consistency, adding water now and then to try and thin it out. This is a great mixture and it's really easy to scoop onto small bases and large bases depending on the consistency. Scooping it on, I just used a wooden coffee stirrer and kept moving the piece of scenery around so that I could reach all the areas. I then left it to dry for many hours. Coming back to it, I added a mixture of Mod Podge and Rhinox hide. I have these prepared already in bottles so that I can make sure that all of my basing is done with the same colour. I just slather it all on, use a what I call sacrificial brush, and get into all those nooks and crannies. This technique doesn't only seal the item, but it also colours it as a base coat. I take a special note to make sure that I actually put some inside the pipe and around the areas that the pipe might have been exposed to mud more. I've also got a grey mixture of Mod Podge, once again use the Citadel colours. I don't have any metallics at the moment, but I do plan on doing so in the future. And I use this on the pipe to try and give it a bit of a base tone that would be more natural for the pipe itself. I then leave all of this to dry for a long time. Once it's dry, it becomes a sort of rubbery texture and will no longer soak up moisture easily. I do some quick Vallejo putty seams to make it look like areas where the pipes have been joined. Then I allow it to dry. Moving on, I use some silver paint, really thick silver paint, to add some texture and cover the entire pipework. It doesn't matter if the grey shows through too much because it's not a massive colour difference, and overall add a bit of depth to the piece. I stipple the paint with a sacrificial brush to add a lot of texture to the outer surface. This is because later on we're going to make it look rusty. I swap to a smaller brush to get on the underside so as not to touch the brown paint, and slowly go around the edges. I also touch up the vent and the pipe that's exposed. I move on to army green and use this for all the little barrels. Moving on, I also start painting the Space Marine in its first coat. Now this paint is not a good coverage paint, which is why I'm using it for terrain now, but it does take a few coats to get a good colour. I wasn't overly happy with the barrels at this point, so I started to add some caps to them, using super glue and some small wooden discs. Luckily, with super glue and activation in my arsenal, these things dry very quickly and I'm able to paint them up to match the rest of the terrain. I added a bit of shining silver here and there where there's different things. And then do another coat on the Space Marine. Now, I am messy, so there's some areas where I accidentally hit the brown with the grey, so I follow it up with a bit of Rhinox hide. Next I use my own black wash. This is an acrylic wash, so not quite the same as using an oil wash, but it gets in all those nooks and crannies and produces a nice depth. And then move on some gold fan once it's all dry. This is to put out the highlights of all those muddy areas, once again adding depth. Now is the fun bit. We can firstly use rust texture all over the pipe to try and get lots of rough areas where some dry brushing can later cling to. I also use Dirty Down Rust. Now, there's loads of YouTubers that have covered this subject and it is fantastic stuff. I have decided at this point to only use it to highlight those seams that I made with the Vallejo putty. This is to make it look like points that it would rust the most would probably be where it was welded. Once it's all dry, I go over the whole thing with Riser Rust to try and put out those high points from the initial texture. I try to focus more around the seam so it looks like it's bleeding out from the Dirty Down Rust effect. Now I use a stippling sponge from Green Stuff World to go over some more of the pipework. This is because at the point it felt more like there was too much contrast between the Dirty Down Rust and the textured rust that I'd done, and I probably should have done this in the first place. I also applied the Dirty Down Rust using a sponge and a piece of kitchen roll. Next we use Tamiya Snow Effect to add snow to the overall base. Using a watered down brush, you can also spread this out so that it feathers into the rest of the basing material. I then had a bit of an accident and found that my UV resin had dried up in the bottle. Unfortunately, this meant that I had to scoop it out and use it as a filler and then mix my own using some clear resin and some acrylic ink. Once the mixture was thoroughly mixed together, it was applied to the surface and then a UV curing torch was used to harden it. Sometimes I had to angle the board itself to be able to get into those tough to reach nooks and crannies. How many times have I said nooks and crannies this video? To add some additional texture and colour depth, I used Nurgle's Rot firstly on top of all of the UV resin. This was feathered in using a sacrificial brush. Probably the third sacrificial brush of this video. Finally, I layered in some vomit coloured paint onto the surface. Once it was all dry, I took the board outside and I used some matte varnish on top of all the surfaces. This tied it all together and added a level of realism. After 24 hours, I went back in with some gloss varnish and reapplied some snow on top. This is because the matte varnish seems to react with the snow, pulling in the brown from underneath.
There is a mud-soaked wasteland infected by Nurgle's rot. Rusted industrial ruins fester with corruption, while the decayed remains of a forgotten ultramarine force lie scattered in the mire. Flies swarm over corpses as disease spreads, turning the planet into a grim landscape of decay and death. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war.